Okay, we're going to work a little bit on our electronics. When we cut out part of our little relief spots in our box, we marked where we wanted our jack to go, or I'm sorry, our volume pot. We want it to basically go about right here. I'm going to drill it from the top so that I don't blow out the veneer or the plywood of the box. So I'm going to drill a little pilot hole where I made my mark, so I can drill it from the top and get it right where I want it. Made me a little pilot hole. Now, switch drill bits, and I've got a little piece of scrap wood with the hole size for my drill bit, and the reason I do that is so that I can kind of put the drill bit where I want it, and it won't, again, most of these boxes are a veneered, the wood on top, it's a plywood, and the wood on top is a decorative layer of mahogany or cedar, and it'll splinter, it'll blow up. And to try and keep that from happening too much, if you put a piece of wood over the top or clamp it down, it'll kind of minimize that a little bit. So that keeps it from blowing out too bad. Alright, so now I can kind of come in here from this side, and then I'll be able to set my jack, or my volume pot down in. Now it'll be kind of tough to wire that down inside there, so I think what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and maybe close our box, and we'll drill the hole for our jack in here. And the easy way I've found to do that is to use like a stepped hole cutting bit. It just seems to work really well, and just drill through the box. You could also use a Forstner bit. Spade bits don't tend to work very well. You could try it, but these work really well. The only thing I suppose I would advise you to do is, since you're drilling into a box that splits in two, is I found if you don't clamp the box, it sometimes tends to break them open. But because as the blade turns into the two halves, it'll split them. So. Alright. Let's get some of our excess stuff here off. Come back with this. I don't know if you've seen these or not. They kind of look like zesters, but they're called microplanes. If you've not got one of these or seen one, they're real handy for kind of opening up these little cigar boxes. They work really well for opening them up, and for things like putting jacks in and such, or even opening up where your neck goes through. They work really well. Alright, that will help open up where my jack goes in. Okay. Now I suppose the thing we need to do is get out our soldering gun and the piezo. I guess we can do a little lesson in wiring for those that don't know it. And for those that do, it might be a refresher. Plug in our soldering iron. Let it heat up a little bit. This will be a pretty simple circuit that we're going to do. See if this will all stay in screen. Our bridge is going to house a piezo disc, a 35mm disc. Which is just going to run through a volume pot. This won't have a tone. It's going to be pretty simple. Just a piezo that's going to set in our bridge, which will set right on top of our cone. The wires will run down through the cone, right into our pot, and then out through our jack. Very simple circuit. We're going to need just a little bit more wire. If you've not done too much wiring or soldering, I'd advise you to practice maybe a little before you get too carried away with this. First thing I think we'll do is we'll wire our jack. Now, hopefully this won't confuse some folks with doing traditional red being, you know, a hot and a black being ground. I'm going to use a white and a green setup because, well, frankly, I buy stuff in bulk, and I bought a bunch of aircraft surplus military grade wire, and you know, I bought probably 1,000, 2,000 foot of the white and a couple thousand foot of the green, and a great deal on it, and so that's what I use. When you can buy it cheap, you run with it. And so we're going to use green as our ground. On your jack, your sleeve is typically your ground wire. So we're going to start with our sleeve. I'm going to put my wire on my ground. One thing you want to do when you're soldering, if you're not used to soldering or you do a lot of it, is after you solder it, don't move it. Give it just 2 seconds, 3 seconds. If you move it before it's had a chance to cool, you can get what they call a cold solder joint. If you move it before it has a chance to set, you can end up with a bad ground, and that'll give you noise in your circuit. You don't want that. You hear a guitar that has a lot of static or crunch in it. A lot of times that's because they have bad grounds, and that can be a result of just that scenario. And sometimes you can see those cold joints because your solder joint should be shiny. And if you can look at a solder joint and it kind of has a dull or a satin, maybe, if you will, look to it, it's a good chance it's a cold joint. But you give it 2-3 seconds to set before you pick it up and move it, should be good to go. It sets pretty fast. Alright, the tip is your hot. So we got our jack done. You always want to leave enough wire so that should you ever have to do a repair, you can pull your jack out. So even though our jack and our pot are only going to be 1.5 inches apart, I'll still leave this much so that I can put it in there. So we're going to say go about so much. Alright, so let's strip off the ends here. Alright, to our pot from the jack, I'll get a little bitty clamp here so I can hold this up. What I like to do is on the back of my volume pot, I like to tin kind of the whole back of it. Hopefully you can see this. Let's get over here so I can make sure you're seeing this. I don't think you've been seeing what I've been doing here. Alright. In case you haven't seen this, I'm going to kind of go back over this real quick because I think you've been out of frame. From our jack, the sleeve, the inside where the plug goes through, our green wire is the ground. The tip is our white wire. Now go into our pot. We're going to ground the green wire to the back of our pot. I'm going to tin my wire a little bit here. From the jack, our hot wire is going to come into the center of our volume pot. It's usually a little easier when I do this in the box, but I wanted to do it out here where I could show this to you a little easier. if you're ever unsure that you have a good connection, or if you know it moves, there's nothing wrong with going back. Hit it again. Just make sure that when you resolder it, that it doesn't move until it's set. That way you know it hasn't, you don't have that cold joint. Alright, so I guess just recapping. Our ground from the jack, back of the pot. Our hot from the jack to the center lug. Alright, now let's solder our piezo. On the piezos we use, the disc, you have the outside of the disc, the metal part of the disc, is going to act as our ground. You can really wire the disc either way. It really doesn't matter that much, because it's kind of going to go one way or the other. I like to put a little bit of solder on the disc before I put the wires on. Give it a second to cool. You got to be careful with these, because if you get them too hot, you can melt the ceramic off of them. So you don't want to put too much heat on this all at one time, because you can melt this part. I like to pre-tin my wire before I go back to the piezo. So once I've got my wire pre-tinned, then I come back and put it on my disc. And again, just give it a second so that it stays on there. Alright, now our piezo is wired. Okay. Now, with our, being this is going to go inside of our bridge, one thing that I like to do with these is I hot glue this up into my disc. So I'm going to put a little bit of hot glue up in here. Set the piezo down in that bed of hot glue. Now, just to make sure that in all the vibration my wires do not come off, I like to put a layer of hot glue over my connections. Because let's face it, as those strings are buzzing on top of this piezo, it's going to vibrate the hell out of this connection. So just for kind of peace of mind, I kind of like to encase the piezo in a little bit of hot glue. It still does its job just fine, but it keeps those wires from coming off of my piezo. Just so that I don't get 50,000 emails. I know I say piezo different than what somebody else says that it's supposed to be said, but hey, tomato, tomato. To each their own. Alright, that will be ready to go on top of my cone. So my hot glue cools just a touch. Just trim this one wire up just a touch. We're going to set our cone kind of up in here in its spot. Hopefully you can see this okay. Let's raise that up just a bit. Maybe we'll zoom in a touch. Yeah, that's going to reach just fine. Okay. Now, our hot wire from the piezo will come to the outside lug of our volume pot. My old eyes could see to thread the needle through that eye. Alright. Okay, and then our ground will come to the back of our pot. And I like to, again, pre-tin the wire just a bit. And then lastly, the last lug of your pot, you ground to the pot. Okay. Alright. I will go grab a little, I've got a little amp here in the shop. And we will test this. Hold on just a moment, I'll grab it. And we'll give it a check. Alright, let's plug this in. Usually take them to the amp to check them, but since this is on the workbench and